Once we've created our masterpiece, we might want to render it. And the reason we want to render it is we want to send it to somebody else, and we want them to see it. The very first thing we can do, no matter what, no matter how we have anything set up, let's turn off cell render. Let's go to output. Try to ignore this, please. There we go. Now, the very first thing we can do, we can always just hit the render button. It's right there in the middle of the screen. It renders to a new window. If we go through these buttons a little bit, there's render region, which allows me to draw a marquee and it will render everything inside. There's render active objects, which I guess that's not an active object, so let's render active object again. Now that I've selected the object, made it object, let's render it. That should render. Oops, I'm sorry. Render active objects. Oh, well, I don't know what I'm doing. Or we can render to the picture viewer, like I said, or we can render view, okay, which renders directly in the editor window. Now, I want to show you a couple of other things. If I choose HyperNerves, notice that instead of having this double layer look, it actually shows you what the object looks like, all smoothed out. We can manipulate that a little bit. It turns out that in the editor, and this is the editor right here, we can actually bump it down to 1, giving it a more coarse mesh, but maybe a more accurate look. Or we can bump it up to 3, giving it a super refined, much smoother look all the way through. I can also do that with the editor. I'm going to turn the renderer, I'm going to turn the editor down to 1 and the renderer down to 1, and I'm going to render it. And you don't see that there's a lot of effect there. It hasn't changed a lot. At the same time, if I delete the Phong button and do it, actually we begin to see that the chair itself is faceted. Remember I explained this to you last week. Phong is a way to make it look smooth even though it's not. I like to edit and work with a faceted object because it tells me how it's going to look when I rapid prototype it or CNC it. Okay? So now we've turned it off and we made it 1, and I want you to see it looks like 1 here and it looks like 1 here. Now let's take that editor, the renderer, in this window, let's turn it up to 3. Notice that it hasn't changed in this window, but it did change in this window. That's changing the actual geometry instead of the way the object is rendered. Now I know this is fairly geeky and fairly weird thing to pay attention to, but it can have some real benefits. Right? The other thing is that I can change this to 1 and 1 again, and then when it renders exactly like it looks. Okay? Rendering is this beautiful, simple thing, but I want you to notice it was a black background and there was no light but the ambient light. Ambient just means this around the world light. You can add lights to objects. I'm going to open this up a little bit, and you do so through the palette where there are lights, spotlights, cameras, backgrounds, floors, and the whole 9 yards. I don't want to go into every detail tonight about this, but what I will do is I'll put a light into the world. It comes in at 0, 0, 0, and you see that it throws a light, so I need to move it somewhere, put it somewhere, and do something with it. All right? Let's just keep moving it up as if it were the sun. And then I can also put a background in the world, and the background comes in. You notice that nothing showed up in the scene, but there is a thing called background. And then to catch the shadow, I'm going to put a floor plane. I can do it with a plane, or this is a floor plane button over here. So let's do it with the floor plane button. Now I have to move it down so it doesn't encroach on the chair. That's pretty good. Now let's just zoom in on this thing, on the chair I mean. We see where the light is. And under light, again, I'm going to open up this window just a little bit so we can see a little bit more. If we zoom down a little bit, we'll see an area where we can say shadow. Let's just give it a little bit of soft shadow. You can make it hard shadow or soft. Let's start with soft. Now I'm going to render the window. There it is. Very nice, right? You have something that kind of vaguely looks like a chair with throwing a little shadow with a little earth underneath it and a light above it. That's not so bad. And you know, the truth of the matter is that I can add another light because I want to warm up some area or another. Like maybe I want a little more detail down here in the back. But I don't want it as bright as the original light. So once again, I'm going to open this area up and I'm going to look in here. And it turns out that I have a button called intensity. And I can turn the intensity down to say 25%. Watch what happens when I do this and render that. We're now seeing some of the shadow in there. I need to move the light to make it better. Let's do it. Let's move this light, that light, over here and up here just a little bit. See what happens. Now we can see underneath the chair a little bit. Notice there's still shadow there, but we can see underneath it. We can see detail in it. That's kind of cool. And actually, interestingly enough, this particular light doesn't throw any shadows. There's no shadow from this light. I can make it have shadow. I'll turn it on. Let's see what it looks like. Let's do a hard shadow from that light and a soft shadow from the other light. If you weren't confused, you definitely will be now. Isn't that beautiful, though? Now we have shadows going on in a crazy which way kind of pattern, right? It goes to show you have a lot of control now over the way this thing looks. Now, don't forget, I made that object so that it looked very faceted. Let's turn the HyperNerves on and go back in, and let's render this at 3 instead of 1. And I'm going to render again, and I'm going to say view fit to size. Oops, that is fit to size. All right, say 100%. That is 100%. Okay. Let's make it a little bigger, shall we? Let's click this button right here, and under output, we can make it from 320 to 240 up to, say, 800 by 600. Let's see what that does. Ah, nice. We've got to open up the window a little bit. But now what we're seeing, sorry about that. My apologies. Now what we're seeing is that the chair is pretty smooth. We're seeing the shadow in great detail and all that stuff. And when I want to, I can say File, Save Picture As. I like JPEGs because they're small. Save picture as a JPEG at 72 dpi. Class chair. Okay? And I'm just going to open that up. So I prove to you that I saved it to my hard drive. Desktop, class chair. There it is. Opening up in a completely different thing. All right? Very nice. Now, we can also add colors and lights and stuff, but that's for another tutorial. The most important thing that you learned here was that you learned some basic rendering. Now I'm going to show you a really cool setting that you can use. It's called Cell Render. And Cell Render is, I'm going to delete it for the moment. I access Cell Render under Effect. And when I do so, I hit Cell Render, and I have some opportunities. I've done this a lot of times. In this case, I'm just going to hit edges. No color, no nothing. And I'm going to render the window. And you'll see that what showed up was, let's go to 200%. What showed up was a line rendering of the scene. Now, if you remember my original scene, the object in HyperNerves was rendered at, if you remember, 3. Let's turn it down to 1, and let's render that in the window right here. So now, that doesn't look good. I'm not sure what happened. Oh, there it is. Good. Pretty cool, right? I think it's cool. Yes. That's kind of a beautiful little chair, right? Once again. The original chair that we were trying to mimic was an old school chair called a Parsons chair, we thought. Now, we've made a decidedly digital version of that chair. And that's kind of cool. And the reason it's digital, or it has kind of a digital gesture, is because now we are showing all of the frames. Oops, sorry about that again. Wish I could get this down a little bit better. We're showing its facets, right? And it's kind of a beautiful thing. I wouldn't mind having a couple of these chairs in my house. And that's why you're taking this class, is to learn how to make them. All right, good. That's your quick tutorial for all the things that we covered. Notice that we covered some things that we hadn't even mentioned before, or that weren't a part of the original assignment of making a chair. All right? Those things were things like weld, knife. We deleted polygon holes, and then we opened them up. We opened them up, and then we closed them down again using both the bridge tool and using the closed polygon hole. So that's a conclusion. That concludes our session for this evening.